Picture this, a Caribbean night, the air thick with salt and gunpowder, the sea glistening like black glass under a swollen moon. Somewhere in the Bahamian waters, a ship rocks gently, but its crew does not rest. On its deck, whispers coil through the shadows like snakes. Men and women alike, faces lit by lantern glow, their eyes darting toward one figure at the rail. Calico Jack Rackham. His name already carries the weight of legend lover of Bonny, scourge of merchant fleets, a pirate who wears silk while others drown in sweat. But tonight, his silks cling damp against his chest, because he knows something the crew dares not say aloud. The Royal Navy is coming, and not just coming, they are hunting. A British war sloop has been trailing them for days, and rumour has it their captain has sworn to bring Jack back alive, so the crown can hang him before the jeering masses of Port Royal. But Jack's crew is fractured, half drunk, half terrified, none eager to face the Navy's cannons. The women aboard, fierce Bonny and deadly Mary Read, seem more pirate than the men put together. They glare at the wavering crew with blades in hand, daring anyone to desert. Jack, for all his swagger, leans against the rail, his face caught between bravado and the creeping shadow of his own mortality. The night deepens. The waves slap harder against the hull. Lanterns flicker, as if warning of a storm that has nothing to do with weather. And then it comes. A lookout's cry splits the night. Sails. Off the starboard bow. Torches burn in the distance. A warship cutting through the dark. Faster than any prayer can travel. Jack closes his eyes, whispering a vow to the sea itself. If he goes down tonight, it will not be quietly. The noose waits, but first there will be blood. The deck erupts. Pistols are loaded, cutlasses drawn, bottles smashed against the deck as courage is swallowed whole. Bonny grips Jack's arm, her voice low and venomous. Fight like a man, or hang like a coward. And as the Navy's cannons thunder into the night, the deck shudders underfoot. Calico Jack's fate tightens like the rope already waiting at the gallows. What happened in that final, desperate clash? That, my friend, is where our story truly begins. The Caribbean night pressed down like a shroud, thick with salt and smoke and the faint, metallic taste of fear. And aboard the Revenge every creak of timber, every flutter of sail seemed to carry with it the whisper of the gallows that awaited Calico Jack Rackham and his cursed crew. The moon, swollen and pale, cast a ghostly sheen over the rigging so that the ropes hung above them like strands of a noose. And Jack himself stood at the rail with one hand clamped around the damp wood, the other still gripping the flask that had run dry hours ago, his silk shirt clinging dark with sweat as if mocking his pretensions of grandeur. Because what use were lace cuffs and a velvet sash when the hangman already knew your measure? And behind him his men muttered like rats in a sinking hold, their voices sharp, anxious, broken with slurred drink or trembling dread, the scrape of whetstones against cutlasses and the clink of pistols being primed rising up in a discordant rhythm of panic. And yet threaded through those sounds was a more dangerous music, the hiss of desertion, the whispers that perhaps it would be better to surrender and hope for mercy than to be blasted into driftwood by the guns of the Royal Navy. Whispers that grew until they were almost words on Jack's own lips. And then Bonny's voice ripped through the dark like the crack of a whip, fierce and hot and scornful. "Shut your damned mouths before I cut them off you," she spat, striding across the deck with her wild red hair flaring in the lamplight and a cutlass flashing in her hand. And none of the men, hardened though they were by years at sea, dared meet her blazing stare and beside her stood Mary Read, leaning casual as a cat against a coil of rope, pistol gleaming in her palm and a humorless smile twitching at her mouth. The two of them radiating such ferocity that it cast the drunken bravado of the men into shadow. And Jack, for all his pride, for all the stories he had spun about himself, could not help but feel the sting of shame at the sight of Anne so fierce and steady, while he himself felt his knees betray him. Yet even in that shame there was pride, because Anne was fire and he silk, and she had defied husband, society, and God himself to follow him into this cursed life, and her fire had always burned him brighter and rawer than he could have ever imagined. But before he could speak, before he could even lift his chin, the cry rang out from the foredeck like a death knell, sails, off the starboard bow, and every head whipped toward the horizon where the black sky was cut by torches bobbing like fiery stars. A ship larger than theirs, sails fat with wind, bearing down with the certainty of judgment. And in that moment every man aboard knew what Jack had known for days. The Navy had found them. The Crown's vengeance had come, and the Noose was already waiting in Port Royal, its fibres itching to close around their necks. And the murmurs of the crew broke into panic, some scrambling for weapons, others staggering for bottles, a few staring hollow-eyed at the doom that grew larger with every passing heartbeat, until Mary Read pushed off the rope and barked out a laugh sharp as a cutlass slash. "Well, lads, here's your chance. Die screaming or die begging. Makes no difference to me." And Jack's throat tightened because she spoke the truth, because for nights he had dreamed of hemp biting into his skin, of the crowd roaring as the trap gave way, of the reek of death in the sun. And now it was no dream but a vision made real in the torches of the ship that carved through the water toward them. And Anne shoved through the stumbling crew to his side, her breath hot at his ear as she hissed, "Fight like a man, Jack, or hang like a coward." And those words, sharp as daggers, broke something inside him so that fear curdled into anger, anger into defiance, and he straightened, flinging the empty flask aside to clatter across the deck, stepping into the center of his men with the moonlight painting him in silver, silk torn and sweat-soaked, but his chin lifted high, his voice rising over the crash of the sea. "Listen to me," he bellowed, and the crew stilled, their wide eyes on him, trembling, doubting. And he spread his arms as though to embrace them all and the gallows besides. "The noose waits for every one of us, aye. But would you rather swing on the gallows like dogs, or fight tonight and carve your names into the bones of the sea?" And there was a ripple of hesitation, some nodding, some still muttering, and Jack seized the moment, his voice swelling with the kind of bravado that had always carried him further than his courage. "They want me alive so they can hang me slow, and they want you dead so they can call themselves heroes. But I say, let them choke on their glory. Let this night be the night they remember, the night Calico Jack Rackham and his devils spat in the face of the Crown." And a few men cheered, ragged and uncertain. But Anne's eyes glinted with fire, and that was enough to give him strength. So he ripped his cutlass free, the blade gleaming in the moonlight, and roared, "Load the cannons, prime your pistols. Sharpen your blades tonight, we fight, and if we die free." And this time the cheer was louder, fists pounding against the deck, feet stomping, fear transmuted into fury by the alchemy of desperation, and the men scrambled to their stations, Anne and Mary moving among them like wolves driving sheep. And Jack stood tall, though his gut twisted, because he knew even in that moment that the rope already tightened around his throat, whether by hemp or by the sea itself, and then the thunder came. The first cannon from the Navy ship, tearing through the night with a roar that shook the bones. And the Revenge shuddered under the impact as iron slammed into her side. Timbers splintering like bones breaking, men screaming as shards of wood ripped through flesh. Lanterns crashing and spilling fire that hissed out in the sea spray. Smoke and salt choking the air until every breath was a struggle. And Jack staggered but caught himself, eyes locking on Anne, who stood tall amid the chaos. Her cutlass raised and her voice a clarion call. "Stand and fight, you bastards," she roared, and in that instant, with the deck heaving and fire licking the sails and the world exploding into smoke and splinters, Jack knew there was no more room for doubt. No more room for silk or lace or legend, only blood and fire and steel. And whether the sea or the gallows claimed him, history would remember this night as the night Calico Jack Rackham made his last stand. The sea was alive with thunder, each cannon's roar shaking the world as iron screamed through the air, tearing sails and splintering masts, the Revenge staggering under the punishment while her crew scrambled like ants on a burning log, some shouting orders, others screaming prayers. And through the choking smoke, Calico Jack Rackham stumbled across his own deck, silk torn, cutlass flashing, his throat raw from rallying men who looked more like ghosts than pirates. And yet he bellowed still, because silence meant surrender, and surrender meant the noose, and the noose was worse than death. And Bonny fought like a woman possessed, hair wild, face smeared with soot, eyes bright with bloodlust as she slashed at any who faltered, her voice rising above the cacophony. "Stand and fight, cowards. Better the sea takes you than the hangman." And Mary Read fired her pistol point blank into a deserter's back before tossing the empty weapon aside and seizing a cutlass. Snarling, "No one runs, not tonight," and Jack saw the men recoil from the ferocity of the women, as if even the Crown's guns were less fearsome than their wrath. The British warship loomed closer, vast and terrible, her decks lined with soldiers in scarlet, torches burning like eyes in the night, her cannons flashing in relentless rhythm, each blast throwing up geysers of water and splinters. And in the moments between thunder, Jack thought he could hear the creak of the gallows, the rope stretching across the leagues to wrap already about his throat. But he shook it off and staggered to the quarterdeck. Seizing the wheel, though, the helmsman lay slumped with half his face gone, blood soaking the planks, and Jack's hands were slick as he wrenched the ship hard, the Revenge groaning like a wounded beast as her bow swung. Cannons belching in ragged reply, smoke billowing, shot screaming out across the black water to hammer the Navy ship's side, sparks flying, wood splintering. And for a heartbeat, just a heartbeat, a cheer rose from his men. But then the return volley came, twice as strong, a broadside that ripped through the Revenge as though she were paper, tearing men in half, shredding sails, and fire leaped greedily along the ropes, licking toward the mast, and Jack swore through his teeth. "Will not burn, not yet," he snarled, leaping down to snatch a bucket, hurling seawater up at the flames, Anne beside him, fighting fire with one hand, an enemy with the other, their voices hoarse with smoke, the air thick and stinging so eyes watered and lungs burned. And still the British bore down, grappling hooks snaking across the gap, iron biting into the Revenge's rail as the ships were drawn together, boards crashing down, soldiers in red surging across like a tide of blood, their muskets flashing, bayonets gleaming. And for an instant the deck was nothing but chaos, smoke and slaughter, Jack slashing wildly, Anne's scream ringing as she drove her blade through a soldier's throat. Mary laughing like a demon as she cut her way through 3 men at once. And though pirates fell around them, though the deck was slick with blood and the sea howled against the hull, still they fought, because to yield was to hang. And as Jack swung his blade in desperate arcs, he thought of Port Royal, of the jeering crowd, of the rough hands binding his arms. And he fought harder, every stroke an act of defiance, every cut a denial of the rope. But then a musket cracked, and the helmsman's bell was struck, the wheel spinning loose, the Revenge lurching violently, throwing men from their feet, some spilling screaming into the sea where dark shapes waited hungrily. And in that instant Jack knew the tide of the fight was turning, the navy pressing harder, the pirates faltering. Yet still Anne and Mary stood unbroken, screaming, slashing, unstoppable, until even the British hesitated before their fury. And Jack, panting, bleeding, saw the truth. His crew were already beaten, their spirits cracked, their bodies broken. But those 2 women burned like stars, fiercer than any man, and he wondered, with bitter taste in his mouth, whether history would remember his name or theirs, whether Calico Jack Rackham was already swallowed by his own legend, while Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read rose immortal in blood. And as that thought tore at him, another thunder shook the deck, another broadside ripping through, and a mast cracked, groaned, toppled, smashing down with a scream of timbers and men, fire exploding as lanterns shattered. And the Revenge reeled, broken, bleeding, her decks littered with the dead and dying. And over it all Jack heard the Navy captain shouting, "Take him alive, Rackham alive." And he felt the jaws of fate closing, the gallows tightening, the noose drawing taut. But he lifted his cutlass anyway, voice breaking as he roared, "We're not done yet," and threw himself into the press of redcoats, as the deck burned beneath his feet and the black water hissed against the hull. The night alive with fire and fury and the endless whisper of the rope that awaited him if he failed. The deck of the Revenge was a hellscape of blood and smoke, the clash of steel and the cries of the dying rising in a hideous chorus that mingled with the groan of timbers and the roar of cannon fire. And Calico Jack Rackham staggered through it all like a man walking the line between life and death, his silk long since scorched and torn, his cutlass nicked and sticky with blood not all his own, the taste of salt and iron coating his tongue so thick he could barely breathe. And still the redcoats came, pouring across the boarding planks like ants from a burning nest, their muskets spitting fire, bayonets flashing, their officers bellowing above the din, "Rackham alive, the rest cut down." And those words chilled him worse than the sea spray because they were the echo of his fate, the proof that the noose already had his name stitched into it. And yet he fought harder, slashing, stabbing, every motion not just survival but rebellion, because if he must swing, then he would swing remembered. And beside him Anne Bonny was fury itself, her face blackened with soot, her hair wild and tangled, her cutlass dripping red as she screamed into the faces of men twice her size, cutting them down with a savagery that froze even seasoned soldiers in their tracks, while Mary Read laughed with each kill, pistol in one hand, blade in the other, carving through the red tide with the grace of a butcher at his work. And Jack saw his men faltering, some throwing down arms, some crawling for the rail, desperate to leap into the black water. But Anne whirled on them, her voice ragged with smoke. "Cowards, every one of you. Better the sea takes you than the rope. But fight, damn you, fight." And her blade caught a deserter at the knee. dropping him screaming as she turned back to the enemy without pause. And Jack felt something inside him twist at the sight. Not just pride or shame, but the sour taste of realization that his so-called legend was held aloft not by his courage but by the fire of these women. And though he spat and roared and raised his blade high, he knew the truth deep in his gut that Anne and Mary were the heart of the fight. And he was clinging to the tatters of his own name, but the navy pressed harder. Soldiers pushing the pirates back toward the mainmast, muskets firing point blank, blood spraying across the deck so slick men slipped and fell, some vanishing overboard to be swallowed by the sea, others crushed beneath the toppled mast that still smouldered with fire. And above it all, the British captain's voice rang clear, "Rackham alive, take him alive." And Jack's heart thundered in his chest as he slashed wildly, teeth bared, screaming, "You'll not take me." But even as he roared, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing on him, the rope already tightening, and in that moment of near despair, Mary Read appeared at his side, blood streaked across her cheek, her eyes alight with madness as she snarled, "If they want you alive, they'll have to go through me first." And she fired her last pistol shot into a redcoat's face before hurling the weapon into another man's skull, drawing a fresh blade from a fallen body without pause, and Jack could only gape at her ferocity, wondering again whether it was her name and Anne's that would outlive this night while his silk and swagger rotted on the gallows. But then a cry rose from the port side, a lookout shrieking, "Another ship! Another ship!" And for a heartbeat every sword faltered, every musket lowered, eyes straining through smoke and fire toward the horizon where lanterns glimmered and sails loomed. And Jack's breath caught because hope flared in him. Could it be rescue? An ally, another band of cutthroats come to snatch them from the jaws of the navy. But then his heart sank as the truth revealed itself. For it was no ally but another enemy, a second sloop of the Royal Navy closing fast, her cannons already turning toward the crippled Revenge, and despair crashed over the pirates like a wave. Men throwing down weapons, some dropping to their knees in surrender, others wailing to whatever God would hear them. And Jack felt the air squeeze from his lungs, because this was it. This was the end. Not fire, not steel, but overwhelming force. Two warships hemming them in like wolves circling a broken stag, and yet Anne Bonny stood unbowed, her voice carrying across the carnage, "Let them come. I'll gut the first bastard to set foot here." And Mary laughed again, high and wild, "Aye. Let's see how many I can take before the rope." And their defiance struck Jack like a blade to the heart, because he knew in that instant that they were the true devils of the sea, and he, for all his silks and swagger, was little more than a shadow clinging to their fire. And still he roared, though his voice cracked, two arms, we fight." But even as the words left his lips, another broadside ripped through the Revenge, splintering her hull, water rushing in below deck as the ship groaned her death song, and flames leapt higher, licking the sails. The smoke so thick it turned the night into a choking nightmare, and Jack staggered, coughing, his vision blurring, and through the haze he saw redcoats swarming, grappling hooks hauling the burning ship closer to the Navy sloop, muskets flashing, blades clashing, his men falling and screaming, Mary bleeding but still slashing, and the world tilted, the deck slanting as the Revenge began to sink beneath their feet, the sea hissing and roaring, eager to claim her. And in that final moment of chaos, Jack felt rough hands seize him, iron gauntlets clamping his arms, a voice shouting, "Rackham alive." And he thrashed, screamed, bit, but more hands came, dragging him down, binding him as the world burned, and he heard Anne's voice cut through it all, raw and venomous. "Jack, remember this, you'll swing like a dog, but I'll die fighting like a man." And those words seared him deeper than any rope. And as the smoke closed in and the deck buckled, Jack Rackham realized with horror that his legend was no longer his own, that Anne and Mary were already immortal, and he, alive but bound, was nothing more than a prisoner of fate, dragged toward the noose that waited in Port Royal. The whispers of the gallows louder than the roar of the sea. The night breaking around him as the Revenge sank into the black water and the British hauled their prize from the flames. The stench of smoke and salt still clung to Calico Jack Rackham as the iron bite of shackles gnawed into his wrists. Each rattle of the chains a grim reminder that his ship lay at the bottom of the sea and his freedom with it. And as the British sloop cut through the dawn-streaked waters toward Port Royal, the silence among the captured pirates was as heavy as a coffin lid. Men slumped and broken, some whimpering prayers, others staring blank-eyed into the horizon where the gallows loomed in their minds. Yet amid the wreckage of pride and courage, two figures remained defiant: Anne Bonny and Mary Read, their clothes torn, faces streaked with soot and blood. Yet their eyes burned hotter than the rising sun, spitting venom at the redcoats who guarded them. And when one soldier dared to sneer, "You'll hang like the rest of your dogs," Anne spat in his face and hissed, "Better the rope than to live your life as a coward." And the soldier struck her, but she only laughed, a wild feral sound that made even hardened sailors glance away. And Jack, bound beside her, felt shame coil in his gut because he could not summon her fire, could not mask the terror that ate at him. For every creak of timber, every gust of wind against the sails, brought them closer to the place he had long dreaded, the place where his story would end with jeers and a drop, and he could not escape the image of the noose waiting, swinging gently like a pendulum, its fibers frayed with the ghosts of the men who had gone before. Yet still he tried to muster words, tried to summon the old swagger, whispering, "We'll find a way out, and you'll see." But she turned those blazing eyes on him and said coldly, "There's no escape for you, Jack, only the rope," and the truth of it cut deeper than any blade. So he fell silent, listening instead to the sea as it hissed along the hull, counting the heartbeats that brought him closer to judgment. And when at last Port Royal rose before them, the sight was a dagger in his chest, the harbour bristling with masts, the fort's cannons gleaming in the morning sun, and above all the scaffold, black against the sky, the noose swaying gently in the breeze as if mocking him, and the crowds already gathered on the docks. Word having spread that the infamous Calico Jack had been taken alive, people jostling, jeering, eager to see him dragged in chains, and the guards hauled them ashore, prodding with muskets. And Jack stumbled on the cobbles, the jeers washing over him like waves, cries of "hang him high," and cut the pirate's tongue out. Rising from the mob, rotten fruit and stones flying through the air. And though he tried to lift his chin to keep some shred of dignity, each blow, each insult chipped away at him until he felt naked, exposed. A man stripped of legend and reduced to a spectacle. But Anne walked proud, her chains clanking like a queen's jewels, her laughter ringing as she taunted the crowd. "Is this all you've got, cowards? You'll need more than fruit to break me." And Mary snarled curses in 3 tongues, spitting blood at a magistrate who dared look smug, and Jack saw how the crowd shifted. how some men glanced uneasily at the women who refused to bow, and he realized bitterly that even in defeat Anne and Mary were feared, while he was pitied, and soon they were hauled into the jail. A stone more that stank of piss and despair, the iron bars slamming shut like the tolling of a bell, and the guards dragged Jack one way, Anne and Mary another, and for the first time since the battle he felt truly alone, the silence pressing in heavy, broken only by the moans of other prisoners and the scurrying of rats. And in that darkness the weight of his choices crushed him. Every memory of silk and wine, every boast, every stolen kiss with Anne beneath the stars, twisted into mockeries, because they had led him here. 2 chains, to rot, to the rope, and yet even in his despair he clung to scraps of hope, imagining bribes, escapes, the sudden miracle of a friendly sail in the harbour. But the days crawled like dying beasts, and with each sunrise he saw the scaffold rise higher, the rope swing clearer, the crowd swell larger, and the whispers of the guards reached his ears. Rackham swings on Friday, and his guts turned to water. And yet when Anne was brought to see him, her face bruised but her spirit unbroken, she leaned close to the bars and whispered, "You'll swing, Jack, but I'll be remembered." And though her words scalded him, he knew she was right, and the night before his trial he sat in the dark, the chains cold around his wrists, and he prayed not to God, who had long abandoned him, but to the sea, the only master he had ever known, begging for a storm, for a wave, for anything to snatch him from the gallows. But the sea was silent, and when dawn came and the guards dragged him out, the sun was cruelly bright, the air thick with the stink of bodies and expectation, the crowd already roaring for blood. And as he stumbled toward the courthouse, Anne's voice rang out behind him, fierce and cutting. "If you had fought like a man, you'd not be going to hang like a dog." And the crowd howled with laughter, and Jack Rackham felt the last tatters of his legend rip away, leaving him naked to the judgment of the world, a man walking not to trial but to execution. And yet somewhere in his chest, deep beneath the shame and fear, a spark of defiance still smouldered, and he swore that if he must die, he would not die silent. The courthouse of Port Royal was packed to bursting, the air thick with sweat and the reek of anticipation, as though the walls themselves leaned inward to taste the spectacle. And Calico Jack Rackham shuffled forward in chains, his wrists raw and bleeding where the irons bit deep, his once proud head bowed beneath the weight of stairs, because every eye in that chamber magistrates in their wigs, merchants fat with profit, women craning from balconies, even the urchins who had slipped in to giawas upon him, the infamous pirate who had sailed the Caribbean in silk and lace, now dragged like a dog to judgment. And though he tried to lift his chin, tried to wear the mask of legend, the laughter and hisses of the crowd stripped him bare, and the prosecutor's voice rang like iron, reciting every sin, every theft, every life taken, painting him not as a man but as a monster, a stain on the sea, while Jack clenched his fists until the iron cut, whispering to himself that he was more than this. He was Calico Jack, lover of Anne Bonny, captain of fire and fear. But when the witnesses rose, merchants, sailors trembling as they recalled the flags of the Revenge, widows sobbing as they spoke of husbands lost, he felt his soul shrink, because their grief was real and his glory was hollow. And when at last the magistrate leaned forward, eyes cold, and pronounced, "John Rackham, known as Calico Jack, you are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead, your body to be displayed as a warning to all who dare raise the black flag." The words struck him like cannon shot, his knees buckling, the chamber erupting in cheers, and he thought, so this is it. This is how my legend ends, not in fire, not in battle, but in chains. Jeered at by those who never dared the sea, and yet even in that moment Bonny's laugh cut through. Sharp as glass, there's your end. Jack swinging like a coward, and though it scalded him, it also lit a spark of rage. A fury that carried him back to his cell, where he paced like a caged beast, clinging to scraps of defiance, imagining escape, plotting wild plans that dissolved with every rattle of chains, while Anne and Mary, kept apart in their own cell, remained as fierce as ever. Anne shouting curses at the guards, Mary mocking the magistrates, their voices carrying through the stone like flames licking at his despair. And Jack both hated and loved them for it, because they reminded him of what he had never been in Broken End, as the days crawled toward Friday. The scaffold rising outside, the noose tested and retested until it swayed in his dreams. He began to feel the rope tightening even in his sleep, waking with a gasp, sweat soaking him, the taste of hemp thick on his tongue. And yet still he clung to hope, praying for storm, for riot, for anything to rip him from the jaws of fate. But the sea was silent and the town eager, and on Thursday night, the eve of his death, he sat in the dark and heard Anne's voice echo through the stone. Softer than before, almost tender. You had your chance, Jack, and you wasted it. Now you'll swing, but I'll be remembered. And he pressed his forehead to the cold wall, tears burning his eyes because he knew she was right. And when dawn came, the guards dragged him out, chains rattling, the sun cruel above. The crowd already roaring, thousands gathered to see the pirate die, children on shoulders, women waving kerchiefs, men shouting for blood, and Jack stumbled, his legs weak. But the guards held him upright, marching him toward the scaffold that loomed like a gallows tree sprouted from stone, its rope swaying gently, hungry, and he felt every step like a nail driven into his coffin. Yet, as he mounted the stairs, heart hammering, sweat dripping, he forced himself to look out, to meet the eyes of the mob, and he tried to summon his old swagger, tried to smile, but his lips trembled. His voice cracked as he muttered, I was a pirate once. I was free. And the crowd jeered, their laughter crashing over him like waves. And then the hangman stepped forward, rough hands seizing him, the rope slipped over his head, the coarse hemp scraping his neck, and he bit his lip to keep from screaming, because he would not give them the satisfaction, but his knees shook, his vision blurred, and he thought of the sea, of nights under the stars with Anne, of the taste of rum, the smell of salt, the roar of cannon, all of it gone, all of it swallowed. And then from the crowd rose a cry, fierce and sudden, and Bonny's voice cutting through the jeers. If you had fought like a man, you'd not be hanging like a dog. And the crowd roared with laughter, but Jack closed his eyes, her words searing into him, and he swore he could hear the sea whispering, calling him home. And as the drum rolled, as the hangman's hand reached for the lever, his heart thundered, his breath came ragged, and he thought, this is it, this is the end. But then the cry of a child rose above the din, shrill and panicked, fire, fire, and heads turned, the crowd shifting, smoke curling from a building near the harbour, shouts rising, guards distracted, confusion rippling through the mob. And in that heartbeat of chaos, Jack felt the noose tighten but not fall, the world pausing on a knife's edge, and he thought, is this my chance, my devil's bargain? Will the rope hold, or will fate break? And the world seemed to tremble, the sea roaring in his ears as if it too held its breath, waiting to see whether Calico Jack Rackham would swing into legend or slip once more into the shadows. The smoke from the harbour fire curled like a phantom over Port Royal, the cries of panic mingling with the jeers of the crowd. And on the scaffold, Calico Jack Rackham felt the rope bite into his neck as the hangman's hand hovered, uncertain, torn between duty and distraction. And for a heartbeat Jack dared to believe the sea itself had sent him this gift. One last chance to slip the noose, but then the soldiers pushed the crowd back. Their muskets raised, the magistrates shouted for calm, and the confusion ebbed like a wave, leaving Jack stranded once more on the wooden platform beneath the burning sun, his heart pounding like a drum of doom, and he realized with bitter clarity that fate was not merciful. Fate was cruel, dangling hope before snapping it away, and the hangman tightened the knot. His breath rank as he muttered, "Best keep still, pirate. It'll be over quick," though Jack knew it was a lie, that his death would be no swift mercy but a slow strangling, his body twitching for the crowd's delight. And as the drums rolled again, his vision swam with memories, the decks of the Revenge alive with laughter, Anne's hand warm in his beneath the stars, the rush of wind in full sails, the roar of cannons tearing through silence, the taste of freedom as sharp as rum and as fleeting as smoke, and he longed for it all with a desperation that tore at his soul. But when he looked out at the sea, glittering beyond the masts, it seemed to turn its back on him, indifferent, as if the ocean itself had abandoned him. And in the press of the crowd he saw Anne Bonny, her hair wild, her eyes alight with fire, standing tall despite her chains, and her voice rang out, fierce and cruel, "Jack, remember this: if you had fought like a man, you'd not be hanging like a dog." And the laughter of thousands thundered around him, but her words cut deeper than the rope, because they were truth, undeniable and eternal. And Mary read beside her, bloodied but unbowed, shouted curses that rattled the soldiers, and Jack felt a twisted pride that at least his final sight was of women fiercer than kings. But the hangman's hand moved to the lever, the crowd hushed, the air thick as the moment before a storm breaks, and Jack closed his eyes, whispering a final prayer not to God but to the sea, begging to be remembered not as a coward but as a pirate who lived free. And the lever fell, the trap gave way, the rope snapped taut, and pain exploded through him as the world blurred into fire and shadow, the roar of the mob fading into the rush of blood in his ears. And he thought, so this is death, this is the end. But in the blackness that closed around him, in the haze of suffocation, he swore he heard something distant, deep, like the boom of waves against hidden cliffs. A voice older than any empire whispering through the salt, "Not yet." And he gasped, or thought he did, his body jerking on the rope, the crowd roaring. But in his fading vision the sea shimmered, and he wondered, in those last ragged heartbeats, whether his soul was being claimed by the deep, whether his legend would not rot on the gallows but be carried on the tide, whispered in the spray, woven into the endless dark of the ocean. And as his eyes dimmed, he saw Anne's face one last time, fierce and eternal, and he knew it would be her name, not his, that endured. Yet still a shadow of his own might drift with the currents, unseen, unburied, waiting for some future sailor to swear they heard the ghost of Calico Jack Rackham laughing across the waves. And then the rope creaked, the mob cheered, and Port Royal claimed another soul, though the sea, silent and infinite, kept its secrets. But here's the thing, mate. History tells us Calico Jack Rackham swung on that gallows, that his body was left to rot as a warning to all who dared fly the black flag. Yet whispers haunt the Caribbean still, Sailors swore that on moonless nights, off the coast of Jamaica, a lone lantern drifts across the waves where no ship sails, its glow swaying like a hanged man in the wind. Some say it's Jack's ghost, forever cursed to wander the waters he once ruled. Others claim that the Navy faked his death, that the hangman's knot was loose, that Rackham was smuggled out under the chaos of fire and crowd, traded as part of a secret bargain, and that he lived his last years quietly in exile, watching the sea but never daring to sail her again. No record proves it. No grave bears his name. All we have are the whispers, the shadows, and the endless roar of the ocean. Did Calico Jack truly die that day, swinging like a dog? Or did the sea keep him in ways the crown could never understand? That, my friend, is a mystery lost to the tide. And if you thought this tale was wild, wait until you hear the next untold pirate story. One darker, bloodier, and stranger than anything you've heard yet. Hit subscribe, keep your lantern lit, and remember, on the open sea, legends never die.